Hello. All right, so for 9E, we're going to talk about a lesson called completing the square. All right, so for this one, we're going to start off just by solving these quadratic equations by factoring. So we're actually going to be using a lot of components of factoring with completing the square. All right, so to start off, we're going to do our ABCs. So I have an A value of 1, have a B value of 7, and a C value of 10. All right, so remember, you're going to do A times C. So 1 times 10, which is going to give you 10. And I want to find the factors of 10 that add up to our B term, which is 7. So factors of 10, we have 1 and 10, and then we have 2 and 5. All right, so my factors that are going to add up to 7 are 2 and 5. So those are the numbers I'm going to use to split the middle. So when I say split the middle, I'm splitting the B term, the middle term. All right, so this 7x is then going to turn into something else. So we're going to have x squared plus 2x plus 5x plus 10. And this is going to equal 0. Let me get rid of that equal sign over there. Don't need that one. All right, so just a reminder, the 2x and the 5x, the terms that you use to split the middle, it doesn't matter which order you write them in. All right, so now I'm going to do my grouping. So I'm going to group the first two terms together and then group the last two terms together. All right, so in the first group, so when I say first group, we're looking at x squared plus 2x. So in that first group, between x squared and 2x, I can take out an x. So when I take out that x value, we have x plus 2. And in the second group over here, we have positive 5x minus 10 plus 10. I'm going to take out that positive 5. And then I'll have x plus 2. All right, so just as a little reminder, the binomials in the parentheses here have to be the exact same. Otherwise, you messed up somewhere. Okay. So now that we have the common binomial here, the x plus 2, now I can factor that out. And then once that's gone, all I have left is x plus 5. All right, so now that I factored it and it's in factored form, now I want to take both of those components of factored form. So I want to take my x plus 2 and x plus 5, and I'm going to set them both equal to 0. So I'm going to have x plus 2 equal to 0 and x plus 5 equal to 0. And I'm going to solve both of those equations. So when I solve them, we're going to solve for x. So I'm going to get rid of that 2 and 5. That's perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. All right. So when I subtract 2 on both sides, on the left side, we're going to have x equals negative 2. And on the right side, we're going to have x equals negative 5. So my solutions here, x equals negative 5, comma, negative 2. So remember, do not put parentheses. These are not a coordinate. Those are individual points. All right, now for the next one over here. I'm going to go through this one a little bit quicker. All right, so if you see here, I want to try a special case. I want to see if I can take the square root of the first and last and see if I can get a whole number. So when I take the square root of x squared, you get x. When you take the square root of 9, you get 3. So it works. All right, but I'm going to do 2 times a and b to check make sure that it actually fully works out. So our a and the b value, so our a value here is 1, and our b value here is 3. Well, I got to take the sign of the middle term, so it's actually a negative 3. So I'm going to do 2 times 1 times negative, that's a 3, times negative 3, and that gives us negative 6. So that actually matches, why does my screen keep moving? So that matches the b term that we have in the original problem, which means this is going to work. So what I'm going to do to make this more understandable, so your binomial here is going to be x minus 3 squared equals 0. So this is a perfect square trinomial. All right, so now I want to solve this equation here for x. So this one's a little bit more simpler, believe it or not, because you don't actually have to do grouping. So if I want to get rid of that squared, what I'm going to do is take the square root of both sides. Because remember, what you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So if I take the square root of both sides, I'm just going to have x minus 3 equals plus or minus 0. All right, so plus or minus 0 is just 0. It doesn't do anything, so I'm just going to get rid of it. So now I just have x minus 3 equals 0 to solve. So I'm going to add, why can I not draw a 3? I'm going to add 3 on both sides. So I'm going to have x equals 3. So this is the final answer. Wow, that is terrible. That is a terrible color to use. All right, so now that we have the factoring problems done, I'm going to move on to the skeletal problem down here. So we're going to solve this problem by completing the square, and every step is laid out for you in each box. All right, so I'm going to start off with just writing the equation in this top box. All right, so the very first step that we need to do is we need to ensure that our a value is going to be equal to 1. So if you look at your equation here, your a value is 3. So because we're doing 3 times x squared, we need to divide everything by 3. So I'm going to factor out that 3. And when I factor it out, I'm going to have x squared minus 8x plus 8 equals 0. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and divide everything by 3 so that I can get rid of it. Because over here on the right side, if I divide it by 3, it's still 0. So I'm going to have x squared minus 8x plus 8 equals 0. So really, this is the equation we're going to be manipulating. All right, so step 2 down here, I'm going to copy this equation down here. So step 2 is I want to move the c value to the right side of the equation. So when I say the c value, we're looking at this 8 right here. All right, so I'm going to move it over. So to move it over, I'm going to subtract it. Just do whatever the opposite is. So we're going to have x squared minus 8x equals negative 8. So you're probably wondering, what the heck? Why did you leave that space there? Well, this is where the completing the square comes into play. So I'm actually going to leave a little blank box here. It's ironically also a square. So remember, what we do to one side, we have to do to the other. So I'm going to add that box value to the other side as well. So now we need to find what's going to go in that box. So that's what step 3 is going to be about. So step 3 is we want to find b divided by 2 squared, and that's what we're going to add to both sides, which is step 4. All right. So I'm going to copy this equation here down here for step 4. Or is that step 5? No, step 4. All right. But in order to find the value that goes in those boxes, I'm going to go back here and do b divided by 2 squared. All right. So be very careful here, because remember the formula for the axis of symmetry is the opposite of b over 2a. In order to complete the square, it's b over 2 all squared. All right, so I'm going to take the b value from our equation. So our b value is right here. It is -8. So I'm going to take that -8, and then I'm going to divide it by 2 and square it. All right. So when I divide -8 by 2, you're going to get -4, and we're going to square it. And then -4 squared is going to give you 16. So that 16 is what we're going to throw down here in both of these boxes. All right. So here, I'm going to put 16 and 16. All right. So that was steps 3 and 4. All right, so now what I want to do is step 5. I want to factor and solve this equation for x. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and copy this equation down here to step 5. And this is the quote unquote hard part. All right, so if you look on the left side of your equation here is always going to be a perfect square trinomial. 100% of the time, always going to be a perfect square trinomial. If it's not a perfect square trinomial, then something happened. It should always be one. All right, so when you factor x squared minus 8x plus 16, remember, keep the sign of the b, so -4, and that's going to be squared. And then that's going to equal -8 plus 16 on the right side, which is then 8. All right, so remember, just kind of a recap. Square root of x squared, which gives you the x. Keep the sign of the b term, which is minus, so that minus is going right there. And then the square root of 16, which is where this 4 came from. All right. So now I'm going to solve this equation for x. All right, so this problem right here is very similar to how we did this problem. So I did this problem right here on purpose. So we're going to take the square root of both sides and then just start solving. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. So I'm going to have x minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 8. All right, so remember, when you're taking a square root, you have to account for both the positive and the negative value. All right, so now I'm going to get rid of this -4. So, because I want to solve for x, I want an x equals equation here. So I want the x to be in front of the plus or minus. So I'm going to do +4, +4, and I'm going to have x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 8. Now, we're technically not done here. The reason we're not done is because the square root of 8 should be broken down and put into simplest radical form. So I'm going to go over here to the side and do a factor tree of 8. So when I do my factor tree of 8, we're going to have a pair of 2's and one leftover 2, which means this is going to be 2 root 2. All right, so I'm going to replace the square root of 8 with 2 root 2. So that means we're going to have x equals 4 plus or minus 2 root 2. This is your final answer. Okay. So as you can see, a chunk of the steps here are going to happen in step 5. So steps 1 through 4 are really just doing the setup, whereas step 5 is really where all of it's happening. All right, so we're going to try some practice problems. So if you're still kind of like, what the heck just happened? Don't worry. Hopefully after seeing a couple of or a few of these practice problems solved out step by step, will kind of help solidify it. All right, so looking here at number 1. So step 1, ensure your A value is 1. In this case, it is. Check, move on. So step 2 is move over the C value. So I'm going to move over the 15 So I'm going to have x squared plus 8x. And I'm going to leave room for a box here. Then equals negative 15 plus that box. That's a terrible box. Still a terrible box, but it's fine. All right. So now that we have our setup here, now we got to find what goes in that box. So I'm going to go over here to the side, and I want to find b divided by 2 squared. So my b value is going to be that positive 8. So I'm going to have positive 8 divided by 2 squared. So 8 divided by 2 is going to give you 4. So 4 squared, which is then going to give you 16. So 16 is what is going to go inside these boxes right here. All right. So the next step is I want to start factoring and solving. Well, just factoring. So over here on the left side, if you remember, this is always going to be a perfect square trinomial. All right, so I'm going to take the square root of the first, which is x, keep the sign of the b, which is plus, and the square root of the last, which is 4. And then you square it. All right, and then on the right side, we have negative 15 plus 16, which just gives you 1. So when I add those together, you're just going to get 1. All right, so now we can start solving. So to keep this from getting a little too messy and too clustered, I'm going to copy and paste. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. So on the left side, when I take the square root of x plus 4 squared, you're just left with x plus 4. And then the square root of 1 is going to be a plus or minus 1. So remember, anytime you take the square root of that value on the right side, you have to include the plus or minus. Because remember, in a quadratic equation, we can have up to 2 solutions. So we have to account for both. And that's how we account for both, that plus and minus. All right, so now we need to move over that 4. So minus 4. So I'm going to have x equals negative 4 plus or minus 1. All right, so because we don't have any radical values here, we can technically keep simplifying. So this is where I'm going to separate it into 2 distinct answers. So in the top, I'm going to do x equals negative 4 minus 1. And in the bottom, I'm going to do negative 4 plus 1. So in the top, negative 4 minus 1 is going to give you negative 5. And in the top, in the bottom, negative 4 plus 1 is going to give you negative 3. So your solution here is going to be x equals negative 5, comma negative 3. All right, so that's the first one. All right, so for number 2. All right, so if you notice, we have 2x squared minus 8x minus 10 equals 4. So first off, your a value is not even 1. Second off, your equation is not even in standard form. So there's kind of a lot happening. So what I'm going to do is I want to get rid of that a value first. So I want to factor out that 2. All right, so when I take out that 2, we're going to have x squared minus 4x minus 5 equals 4. So now I want to get rid of that 2. So I'm going to have x squared minus 4x minus 5 equals 2. All right, so we're getting closer to standard form, but now I got to get rid of that c value. So I'm going to move that c value over so that I can replace it with the box. So I'm going to have x squared minus 4x plus that 5 is gone. All right, and then 2 plus 5, which gives me, that's not a 7, plus the box. The box. The box. There we go. All right, so now I got to figure out what's going to go in the box. So my b value here is -4. So b divided by 2 squared. All right, so our b value in this case is -4. All right, so -4 divided by 2 is going to give you -2 squared. And then when you square it, you get a +4. So I'm going to put 4 in both of these boxes. All right, so now I'm going to factor. So on the left side, square root of the first, which gives you x. Keep the sign of the b, which is minus, and the square root of the last, which gives you 2. And then square it. And then on the right side, you're going to have 7 plus 4, which is going to give you 11. All right, so I'm going to copy the equation here. And now I want to solve it. All right, so I'm going to do the square root of both sides. So I have x minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 11. Now, I can't break down the square root of 11 at all, so that means there's no factor tree that you can do in this one. So you can move over the 2. And remember, it goes in front of the plus and minus. So x equals 2 plus or minus square root of 11. So this is your final answer. So your final answer could be a number plus or minus a radical, or it could be whole numbers. Like your answer could look like a whole bunch of different things. All right, so we're going to start stepping it up with these last 4. All right, so looking at number 3 here. So our a value is 1, we're good. So move on to step 2, which is move over the c value. Got to make room for the box. So I'm going to have x squared minus 6x. And add the box. Equals -3 plus 7, which gives you +4, plus the box. All right, now we got to find what's going to go in the box. All right, so my b value here is -6. So b divided by 2 squared. All right, so our b value here is -6, so that's what's going to get written there. All right, so now over here, I'm going to start solving. So -6 divided by 2 is -3 squared. Then square it and you get 9. So 9 is written in the boxes. All right, so now we're going to start factoring. All right, so square root of the first, which is x, then keep the sign of the b, and then square root of the last, which is 3, and it's squared. All right, and then on the right side, we're going to have 4 plus 9, which gives you 13. All righty. So now I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So I'm going to have x minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 13. And then I'm going to add that 3 on both sides. So we're going to have x equals 3 plus or minus the square root of 13. Hopefully no one's crying by now. If you are, I'm sorry. All right, number 4. So with number 4 here, our a value is 1, so we're good there. Our c value is actually already moved over for us, so that's already done too. So we actually get to start with step 3. So I'm going to go ahead and start adding the box on both sides, because we can go ahead and just start with b divided by 2 squared. All righty. So Your b value here is -6. So I'm just going to go ahead and go right into it. So -6 divided by 2 squared. So we're going to have -3 squared, which is equal to 9. So I'm going to add 9 to both sides. All right, so now if I factor the left side, square root of x squared, that gives us x. Keep the sign of the b, which is minus, and keep this, square root of the last term, which is 3, then square it. And the -30 plus 9 is going to give you -21. All right, so here, I'm ready to start taking the square roots. All right, so when I take the square root of both sides, we're going to get x minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of -21. So a big issue here is you cannot take the square root of a negative number. Well, you can, but that's algebra 2. That's using complex and imaginary numbers. So for right now, for algebra 1 purposes, what this means is there's just no real solution. Perfect. An arrow is exactly what I wanted. All right, so for any algebra 2 folks out there, if you were to do the square root of -21, this would be 21i. Because if you remember, the square root of -1 is equal to I. So you could go ahead and find the complex roots if you wanted to as well. All right. So moving on to number 5. So these are going to be the more tricky ones. All right, so first off, it's not even in standard form. So we got to put it in standard form first. So I'm going to add over this 24x, put it right back where it belongs. Because we want the a and b on the same side and the c on it the other side. So 2x squared plus 24x equals -8. So my a value is not 1, so I'm going to go ahead and factor out that 2. So when I factor out that 2, I'm going to have x squared plus 12x equals -8. And then I'm going to divide everything by that 2. All right, so I'm going to have x squared plus 12x. Now that that a value is 1, I'm going to go ahead and write a space for the box. And that's going to equal -4 plus the box. All right, so now we got to find out what's going to go in those boxes. So we have a b value of 12. All right, so we're going to do 12 divided by 2, all squared. So 12 divided by 2 is going to give you 6 squared, which is equal to 36. All right, so 36 is going to be written. That's a 36. There we go. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. All right, so now on the left side, I'm going to go ahead and start factoring. So the square root of x squared gives you x, keep the sign. So addition, square root of the last, which gives you 6, and then square. And that's going to equal -4 plus 36, which is going to give you a positive 32. All right, so now I want to go ahead and find my x value. So now I'm going to go ahead and take the square root. So x plus 6 equals plus or minus square root of 32. All right, and now I'm going to move over the 6. Remember, it goes in the front. All right, so we're going to have x equals -6 plus or minus the square root of 32. Now, the square root of 32 can be broken down So I'm going to go ahead and do this over here off to the side. So 32, you can use 4 and 8. Then 8 breaks down to 4 and 2. I'm actually going to go ahead and use the pair of 4s here. All right, which means this is going to be the same as 4 root 2. So I'm going to replace the square root of 32 with 4 root 2. So we're going to have x equals -6 plus or minus 4 root 2. So this is your final answer. I know you're all having so much fun right now. All right, number 6. So if you look here, now your a value, instead of it being a number bigger than 1, now it's actually a number that's smaller than 1. All right, so what I'm going to do is that number needs to be 1. So instead of multiplying or dividing by a number, I'm actually going to multiply both sides. All right, so when I multiply both sides, I got to make sure I multiply everything. So I'm going to distribute that 2, which means I'm going to have x squared minus 20x plus 25 equals 0, because 0 times 2 is still 0. All right, now I'm going to move over that 25. So I'm going to have x squared minus 20x. I'm going to go ahead and write a space for the box. And that's going to equal -25 plus the box. All right, so I need to find that value. All right, so my b value here is going to be -20. So that's what I need to find the square value. So -20 divided by 2, all squared. It's going to give you -10 squared, which is going to be equal to 100. So that's what I'm going to add to both sides. All right. So on the left side, when I start factoring, square root here is going to be x, keep the sign, so minus, and then square root of the last, which is 10 squared, equals -25 plus 100, which is 75. All right, and now I'm going to go ahead and start solving. All right, so square root of the first, or just square root of both sides. So x minus 10 is going to equal plus or minus the square root of 75. All right, I'm going to add over that 10. So I have x equals 10 plus or minus the square root of 75. Now I want to break down the square root of 75. So I'm going to go over here, do my factor tree off to the side. So factors are 3 and 25. And then 25 breaks into 5 and 5. So my pairs are 5, and I have a leftover of 3. So this is going to be the same as 5 root 3. So I'm going to replace the square root of 75 with 5 root 3. So I'm going to have x equals 10 plus or minus 5 root 3. And that's it.